Welcome, everyone, to another edition of The Natural Nurse and Dr. Z. Hey, this is Dr. Z, Dr. Eugene Zamprone, naturopathic physician, herbalist, professor at the University of Bridgeport, and one of the founding fathers of the program there. And usually we're here with the natural nurse. She's on break, talking about issues in health, wellness, and alternative medicine today. And you can always learn about our various activities in our eco tours and walks and talks and things like that on our respected websites. That's naturalnurse.com or drznaturally.com. And certainly send us a message and let us know if you have an interesting guest or you read an interesting book and you'd like to hear more about a particular topic. So that's kind of how we work it here. And so we're really excited that you took time out of your day to join us. And so on with the program. So we have Dr. Garry here, and he's a chiropractor and nutritionist in New York and a clinical social worker. He also is a diplomat of the Shanghai Research Institute of Acupuncture, practices acupuncture and things like that, diplomat of the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine. It's kind of interesting. I wrote a chapter with Dr. Kamai in a book on anti-aging in the 80s, actually the 90s, I guess, with Dr. Mitchell Genn and the late Dr. Serafina Corsello. So that's interesting that we maybe touch base on that. And also he works with something called emotional clearing technique. So that's important because I think that that's a lot of the toxicity in the body, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Toxicity and detoxification. So welcome, Dr. DeBrant.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, great. Listen, man, when people hear detox, they think that like you're an opioid clinic or you're helping people, get off the booze and things like that. So I know complementary and alternative practitioners are using different words. I trained with the late Dr. Walter Crinion, who was a master at detoxification, and Bill Ray, who runs a whole hospital for detoxification out in Texas, Environmental Health Center of Dallas. So we're kind of talking about sort of depuration, really, instead of detoxification as it's kind of known. But I think that's kind of understandable to the lay people. What's your definition of detoxification?
Well, I think you bring up a really good point, which is there's a lot of sort of either misinformation or just a conglomeration of a lot of topics or names, things like cleanse or elimination or things like that. And I'm sort of I guess maybe a purist about it. I go back and think about like the guy who really discovered phase 1 and phase 2 and he discovered 2 phases. It was a researcher back in 1948. I think he actually got a Nobel Prize nomination for it, for really understanding that when we're talking about detoxification, we're talking about an inherently complex process in the human body that really we're capable of doing on our own, but often can't anymore because of the toxic load that we're doing to ourselves in our world today. So detoxification is a bodily process that's natural to all human beings, and perhaps to everybody in the animal kingdom as well. I think there are detoxification systems that have been looked at in other animals as well.
So there's all kinds of toxins that we're exposed to. You talked about in your bio. I talked about your work with emotional toxins, which I find interesting, as I do a lot of classical homeopathy on patients and work with their deep emotions too. And you have, background, of course, in social work and counseling and helping people get rid of behaviors. So there's toxins on that level, but then there's also, the myriad of things that we breathe and are exposed to all the time in our world, and who knows, maybe even getting incorporated into our DNA. I always think that, being a homeopath, there were miasms that Dr. Hahnemann studied back in the day, and I think we have a plastic miasm in this day and age. Have you ever heard of that before?
I haven't actually heard of that, but I certainly understand the idea of miasms and the fact that we are, I think, fundamentally changing our DNA by the amount of toxins and pollutants on every level. You mentioned the emotional level, but I just recently read a study where, rain has been studied forever in terms of acid content and all of that. But one of the things that the study pointed out was an unintended discovery, which was that microplastics are now in our rain. So we're literally raining microplastics down on ourselves. So when we talk about toxicity and we think about us, as the sort of microbiome, if you will, the little creatures running around on the surface of the earth, we're the little bugs that inhabit the earth, and we're literally, polluting our environment to the point where we may not be able to sustain ourselves. Much the same way, if you think on a microcosmic level, we have the microbiota, the bacteria inside of us that are also being affected by what we're doing to it every day. We eat, breathe, drink, and do all the things we know that bring toxicity into the body.
So detoxing is a defense mechanism, you would say, just like stomach acid's a defense mechanism, our skin, the lining of our GI tract, our immunoglobulins, all those types of cilia, mucus, vomiting, it's all, diarrhea, it's all part of the greater defensive system, how the body rights the wrong and establishes homeostasis. I guess that's what the body's trying to do.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think homeostasis is sort of a key word, and anytime I think of homeostasis, I also think of the sort of dysregulation that comes with toxifying ourselves. And then the word that I always think of, there used to be a saying, money is the root of all evil. I think they attributed it to Marx or whatever. And I always tell people it's not money, it's inflammation is the root of all evil. And we want to really look at the ways that we're making ourselves more inflamed in a moment-to-moment, life that we're leading, because the inflammation is what is partly what's the sequelae of becoming more toxic. The more toxic we get, the more inflamed we get, and the more inflamed we get, the more in trouble we get.
So what are some of the toxins that we're challenged with? You talked about plastic and rain. I know there's, of course, lots of heavy metals in our environment, and I know Long Island has a problem with their groundwater from seepage into the aquifers, but I would assume there's both internal toxins that we make, like uric acid and things like that, and cellular debris, and then there's, these external toxins.
Yeah, the list, we've got an hour list of external toxins. If we really went through it, would probably take up the entire hour because there's just so many of them. But you point out plastics, and that's a good one because it's a ubiquitous one. It's everywhere now. And plastics used to be thought of, the things that are in plastics like phthalates or BPA, bisphenol A, used to be considered things that were generally regarded as safe. They didn't disassociate in the containers, and we didn't have to worry about them. Now, as research has gotten more sophisticated and maybe even a little bit more liberal in the sense of the industry, the plastic industry, wanting to make us all feel safe with plastics, we've realized that BPA and phthalates are tremendous endocrine and hormone disruptors, and they play a huge role in creating inflammation in the body. They play a role in creating obesity in the body. So there's a term that never was used before, I think maybe 6 or 7 years ago, the term obesogen. And that's a substance that creates obesity. And we now have whole classes of substances, BPA and phthalates are in those, that actually cause obesity just by the continual use. And if you think of the bottled water industry, it is a huge industry. But look at beyond that, look at the plastic use of everywhere. Every food container now that we store food in or get food from a restaurant in is all made with plastics, and even the linings of the filters and things like that we use in our refrigerators are plastic, and all of that, it's everywhere. So that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of toxins, but those are ones that people can relate to very readily, I think.
Then petrochemicals are huge, in spray paints and nail polish and volatile organic compounds, as they call them, the VOCs. What's the toxin now that leaked from the airport fuel that is getting into the rivers? I can't remember the name of it, but anyway, yeah. So these are all organic. And how about even bleach and some of the halogens?
Yeah, there's so many, again, that are quite pervasive. Another one that people don't ever really pay attention to, but it's something we're in contact with every day, are flame retardants. Because every piece of furniture that we sit on or every bed that we sleep on are loaded with flame retardants because it's the policy of the government to basically make sure that we don't leave cigarettes on and burn ourselves up or put something down that's hot. And so everything has to be coated with flame retardants, and those flame retardants are incredibly invasive and difficult for the liver, the kidneys, and the colon to basically take care of in terms of breaking them down. I mentioned those three organs mostly because I think of them as the primary organs of detoxification, although, as we all know, every organ and gland has the capacity to detoxify. It's just that some of them do more of it or are more key players in the role of detoxification in the body.
So take us through the journey of a toxin into our body and kind of what happens as it travels through and what our body tries to do with it and what substances it uses to try to neutralize or wash out those toxins.
Yeah, as I mentioned, there's a guy named Roger Miller who was the researcher who really looked at the phases of detoxification. And one thing I sort of want to make clear for me, detoxification is really a nutrient-driven process, meaning you're asking the body to work harder to clean, and if it's struggling because the organs like that I mentioned, the liver, the colon, and the kidneys, and the skin to a large degree as well, are toxic, you're going to have to assist the body in some way because those phases, phase 1 and phase 2, and there's a phase 3 as well, get overwhelmed. So the liver, which does about roughly 60% of the total detoxification capacity of the body, is really charged with doing a lot of it, and it has a phase 1 and a phase 2. It's called biotransformation, and it's basically where things like glutathione, certain vitamins like A, acid, there's a host of them, the B vitamins, all of the antioxidants that we would think of people would think of in terms of binding with free radicals are necessary, as well as the macronutrients of proteins and carbohydrates and fats in certain orders in order to facilitate our body being able to neutralize and break down toxins in the body. We all know that toxins have a preference, if you will, most toxins for fat in the body, for fat cells. So when we first look at a toxin in the body, it's really where we're looking at fat soluble, how we're breaking that down, how is the body managing to get rid of the toxin or separate it out from the fat and break it down to make it water soluble so that eventually it can be carried out in the urine or the feces or the sweat or however we're going to get rid of it. And it's that process, that space between that phase 1 and phase 2 where things often go wrong, and that place is really the birthplace of a lot of problems in the body with degenerative diseases like cancer, autoimmune diseases, things like that intermediate metabolites, the breaking down process where things are made into smaller and easily more degraded products. So that process needs a lot of nutritional help. And unfortunately, as our diet becomes more and more processed, we're giving it less help and more load rather than help.
So these intermediates that go from the phase 1 to the phase 2, and you'll have to comment on the phase 3. That might be new to the listeners at some point in your conversation, Doc. So you're saying that when you go from the first phase to the second phase, the body's trying to make this toxin less toxin and more water soluble so it can leave the fat and then exit the body through the organ. Well, I guess what they call the emunctories is the old word for it, the organs of elimination or pathways of elimination. But you say that sometimes the toxin gets caught and in Never Never Land, kind of, and then becomes more damaging?
Yeah, that's right. Instead of an intermediate metabolite, an intermediate product, if you will, they become reactive intermediate products. And that word reactive is really, just like you might imagine it in terms of a reactor, a nuclear reactor, or something like that. Once you create a reactive element, it's more fragile, it's more subject to things going wrong with it, and it becomes a kindling, if you will, for lighting the fire of inflammation and really creating havoc in our detoxification system and our ability to render toxins useless and harmless in the body, which is really, again, the body is designed to do that. It's simply that we're not necessarily giving it what it needs anymore. I mean, I read this really fascinating study about where our food sources have come from through the entire curve of human history, and they outlined about 80,000 food sources. And at this point, the standard American diet is made up of 67% of food sources that come from 3 places. And they're not hard to figure out. It's wheat, soy, and corn. So these are 3 of the hardest foods to digest. They're the ones that are most difficult in terms of breaking down. There's genetically modified, of course, in all of these, and those things are really difficult on the body in every sense of the word, whether you have an actual allergy to them or whether you're simply incompatible and intolerant of them. So our diet is one of the largest places where we're creating havoc for our detox system.
Now, someone's not going to come in and say, "Hey, Doc, I feel toxic." They might have a constellation of signs and symptoms and you're going to, I don't know, look at their tongue. I know you're trained in Chinese medicine. I do that too. You might do a very good physical exam. You may run some laboratory, which we should talk about. In other words, is there any way to quantify that someone's toxic? I know the National Adipose study in the 1990s where they kind of jabbed a needle in everyone's jelly roll. I guess people have bigger jelly rolls than others. They found that we all had styrofoam in us, plastics, various things. I can't remember the exact quantity or quality of the toxins they found, but I know that it was in everyone. So they're pervasive in our bodies. So the question is, how do you know if you need to detoxify, or do you just assume that everyone does, or are there sophisticated testing in nutritional medicine to figure these things out?
Yeah, that's a lot of good thoughts in there, a lot of good questions. For me, I make an assumption, and this just comes from my own personal experience in my own life. I was an undiagnosed diabetic when I was 9 years old. My father was a Coca-Cola salesman, and I had all the soda that I could ever want to drink when I was 5, and by the time I was 9, I was already a type 2 diabetic. So, wow. I learned early on, literally, this isn't an abstract idea for me, that I had to take control over my own life and really work on cleaning up my diet. And I went through a whole series of what I thought at the time were detoxification protocols and things like that in order to break through the whole idea of diabetes and insulin resistance and detoxify myself. I did a lot of things that I think now are probably pretty crazy. I went on 3-week water, cleanses and things like that. But it was a teaching moment and a teaching cycle for me to understand that we're all pretty toxic. There are definitely things you can do to identify them. But one of the things you want to do is listen really carefully when a person walks in the office, because they'll tell you whether they're toxic in some way or another, because they'll tell you their symptoms. And not that every one of these symptoms is simply because of toxicity, but you'll see patterns that show up over and over again. Headaches, fatigue, GI complaints of gas or bloating after they eat, constipation, diarrhea, joint pain. The list goes on. A tendency to have a lot of infections or a weak immune system, an intolerance to interventions. And this is a really subtle one, but it shows up a lot in people more now than it did when I first came into practice. People will be intolerant to even homeopathics or to herbs or to anything else. They'll only be able to take a tiny little bit, or they'll get very reactive and they'll they'll break out in rashes, or they'll have other kinds of unpleasant symptoms. So there's a whole host of things to ask and to look at, and certainly one of the things is your bowel habits, because everybody in America that I can see is constipated, unless they've got Crohn's or something else that moves them in another direction. But people come in and tell me right away, "Oh, I'm regular as could be, Doc. I go, once every other day or once a day." And the next question is, after you have your coffee? And they say, "Yeah, I go, right away." And we all, recognize that that's constipation, because coffee will induce your bowel movement. If you pull the coffee out, you'll find that the person's probably going once every 2, 3, or 4 or 5 days. And really, a well-functioning system that isn't overloaded with toxins ought to be going basically every time you have a meal, shortly thereafter, or something close to that. And we're not anywhere near, near that level for most of us.
So there's an added level of toxicity from actually the flora imbalance. So not only are we looking at, the plastics and heavy metals and, volatile organic compounds and the pretty poisons, the cosmetics and nutraceutical things, or pharmaceutical things, but you're saying there's an added level of toxicity from the gut flora being out of balance too, because that's going to get into the bloodstream and then be presented to the liver. So that's an interesting point, that you have to look at the gut flora too, because that you could have an overgrowth of microorganisms or fungus or whatever, parasites, and that's just another toxin.
Absolutely. You hit on, I think, probably one of the biggest areas of research now going on, and the term the gut-brain axis is one that's getting more and more a study and an evaluation, because people are starting to finally put together that a imbalanced microflora in the gut is playing a huge role in one of the things that I deal with a lot, because, as you mentioned, I'm a psychotherapist, and I'm always looking to connect people's emotional states, if they're suffering from anxiety or depression, or they have a lot of mood swings or other kinds of emotional motility, with what's going on in their gut. And the axis between those places, the fact that the microbiome and the bacteria that are in our gut are often out of balance, and their products, what they're producing, are literally communicating with the brain, and often influencing and or encouraging either anxiety or depression or some of those other states, is just a huge place for us to look. Because now when you think about it, what we're really saying is, you are what you eat, which we all used to coin back in the day, and then of course we've refined it to you are what you assimilate. But now we're even saying your moods and your emotional states are directly related to what it is that's going on in your gut. The conveyor, or the means that happens, is quite sophisticated, but the vagus nerve really deserves a mention here, because that's the real main communicating pathway between the gut and the brain.
Huh. So you are what you, I like that, you are what you eat, you are what you absorb or assimilate, and then you are what you digest or based on your flora. Fascinating. Different areas of toxicity that most of our listeners may not have even appreciated. So thank you for that. So, okay, so, so are we going to run, are there any tests that we're going to run, or no? Because here's my point. So back in the day when I was training, we learned about Dr. Shelton's work. Dr. Shelton was a naturopath back in, I think he was around in the 20s and 30s, and he started the idea of water fasting. And his idea was to induce a healing crisis in people, which is kind of like when the body goes through a serious reaction to the removal of the toxins. And so he believed that, he was pretty heroic. Even though he was a naturopath, he would be like, okay, let's just fast and, see what happens. And so people would go on a water fast, whether they were prepared or not, and the what would hit the fan. And they would go through a healing crisis and get a lot of symptoms and things. And people would sometimes were able to ride that crisis and move on to get over their chronic disease. But then you have the worker like Dr. Bland, who's like saying, no, we really need to probably prepare the body for a month. It's kind of ironic. The very people who need a detox can't detox the moment they come into the office, according to these thinkers, because they're not ready. They don't have the nutrients in their liver to support detoxification. What's your feelings about that? Are you more of like a Shelton guy, let's ride the healing crisis, or are you more prepping people for detoxification?
Yeah, it's a great question and point. I think I mentioned that I used to do like those water fasts, water cleanses, whatever we want to call them, and that was in my youth and my folly is what I think of it as. Because I think more now that, especially now, because I think, again, we're watching the degradation of our health and our immune systems and our level of inflammation rising all the time. I think, I've been in practice 40 years. I see things now in children that I never saw unless they were young adults or adults. I see obesity in 1-year-olds. I see chronic asthma when they're born. I mean, they come out and they're asthmatic, and within 3 months they're already talking about putting them on inhalers and other things. The stuff that we're seeing now suggests that people are more fragile, and the ecosystem, the microbiome of who we are, needs to really be honored. And I'm more of the belief, and I know Dr. Bland well, to prepare to gently induce what we have to do and really give the person the nutrients necessary so that they don't wind up having the shock of what probably when I know I went through and other people did when they did extended water fasts. I think we're just not in the place anymore of having the resiliency, and that's an important word, because resiliency really means our ability to adapt and to manage whatever is thrown at us, whether it's happening externally or we're doing it because we're inducing a crisis or we're inducing a surge in detoxification.
Yeah, and so tell us a little bit about what types of things you would do to prepare people for detoxing. I go back to ancient Ayurveda before they do panchakarma. You'd get a massage with 5 people working on you and pouring oils and ghee in your body because their philosophy, I mean, it's kind of interesting that they knew this stuff, that they believed that the toxins left with the oils, and you want to saturate people's oleation, they used to call it. And to me, when I was reading that, I was like, boy, that's kind of interesting, because a lot of these toxins are stored in the fat. They're stored, and it's kind of like they don't want to leave. It's like our body's homeostasis is like, well, I'm going to hold on to this toxin and store it in a safe place instead of having it rattling around the body, binding with DNA and causing inflammation like you were talking about. I'd rather just store it in a junk closet, or throw it in a whatever the body's repositories, versus it being like a loose cannon creating trouble until the moment is right when I can get this out of my body. So it was interesting that they kind of figured this out many thousands of years ago about the oleation thing, which I find is sometimes missing from current day detox theories, and even practitioners not doing those types of things, looking at the ancient wisdom. But what are some of the things that you do to prepare people for detoxing?
Yeah, it's a really important part of the process to engage with people. And again, speaking holistically here, engage with them not only just on the physical level, but also on the emotional and spiritual and mental level about what they're going to do and what we're attempting to do. People think of detoxification, you said this in the opening, of like, liver, or you're going to do it for alcohol, or you're going to do it for opioids, or whatever. I want people to really recognize, and I'll spend some time talking to them about this, that this is a self-nurturing process. And in order to do that, we have to get the body primed and ready, and that's a conscious thing. You're going to wind up asking them to breathe differently than most of us breathe in this society. We're going to ask them to look at their water intake and see whether they're adequately hydrated, and that's almost 100% not the case in people that I see. And then we're going to ask them to do some diet diaries and some analysis of their own, because this is really very important for patient education, for them to be realizing what they're actually putting into their bodies and when and how they feel. So my diet diary form doesn't just have what you're eating, it has how you felt when you ate it. And bringing awareness into the process is a huge piece of helping people get ready and engage with it, instead of something that somebody's telling them to do, like a doctor's telling them to take this next drug or chemotherapy or whatever they're going to do. This is actually getting them to be a co-sponsor, a co-facilitator for their own well-being. And then I love using oils. I mean, the modern-day version of that, obviously, is oil pulling with coconut oil in the mouth to help, get rid of bacteria and caries in the mouth. But I love the idea of self-care. I think it's just a place that we miss out in our society. We just don't do it enough. So I'll introduce them to coconut oil, to sesame oil, to different oils that they can use on their bodies to rub in, massage, and then dry skin brushing and things like that. It's all about getting them to want to engage with their body in a self-loving, self-nurturing way, because detoxification, in my mind, is the ultimate act of that. We're asking the body to let go, and as you, I think, exactly point out right, the body often has an inherent wisdom that says, I ain't letting this toxin out. It's going to disrupt the entire system if I do. So the fat cells and the internal voice of the body says, hold on to it. What we're doing by prepping the body is saying, it's okay, we got your back here. Mm-hmm. We're going to let you, get rid of this in a way that isn't going to threaten you or in any way make you unsafe or unhealthy.
Right. Well, we're going to take a quick break and go to our Natural Medicine Chest mini modular program. And when we return, we're going to be talking about some of the symptoms you might have when you're detoxing and some of the methods, the other methods that Dr. DeBrandt is going to teach us about detoxification, and talk about what's the goal? How should we feel when we're done, and how many times do we have to do this, and just some more details. So stay with us right here.
You are listening to PRN, Progressive Radio Network.
On this edition of the Natural Medicine Chest, we'll discuss jojoba, the miracle plant of the desert.
Jojoba is spelled Jojoba, but is pronounced according to its Spanish origins. The jojoba plant grows in the American Southwest and the Sonoran Desert in Mexico. The jojoba is a large bush-like plant resembling mistletoe. It can reach a height of 15 feet and can live from 100 to 200 years. The Sonoran Indians have used the oil pressed from the jojoba beans for centuries. Father Juniper Serra, founder of 21 missions in California, noted in the early 1700s that the local Indians were using jojoba oil for treating sores, cuts, bruises, burns, and as a diet supplement, to soothe skin from sun and wind burns, as a cooking oil, and even as a beverage.
The importance of jojoba as a cash crop was proclaimed in 1935. But it was not until 1974, when the killing of sperm whales was banned, that the government began to study jojoba oil in depth as a substitute for whale oil. The National Academy of Sciences concluded jojoba oil has a radically different chemical structure than any other known oil. Most oils break down or turn rancid. Jojoba, on the other hand, is hypoallergenic, non-toxic, never turns rancid, and does not break down even under high temperature and pressure.
The University of California at Riverside did a study where they cooked 27 batches of popcorn in the same heated jojoba oil. The last batch was just as perfect as the first. These unusual properties are unique to jojoba oil because, chemically speaking, jojoba oil is not really an oil at all, but is a liquid wax. Its composition is almost identical to sebum, which is the oil secreted by human sebaceous glands to help to protect the skin from the environment.
Jojoba has a myriad of usages. The cosmetic industry takes advantage of its compatibility to human skin by adding it to shampoos, conditioners, moisturizers, and many other cosmetic products. In medicine, jojoba can be used directly on rashes, cuts, and psoriasis. It may also be used as a lubricant for artificial hearts. Jojoba contains a natural appetite suppressant, which can be used in weight loss products. It has no known side effects. In industry, jojoba is known to be a superior engine lubricant and will cause a car to run 20 to 30 degrees cooler when added to the crankcase oil.
So, if you are interested in a miracle plant from the desert, reach for jojoba in your natural medicine chest.
Okay, and welcome back to The Natural Nurse and Dr. Z. And this is Dr. Z, and I'm interviewing Dr. Garry DeBrandt, and he is a chiropractor and nutritionist and has a degree in acupuncture, and he's a social worker, and he knows quite a bit about detoxification and emotional clearing technique. And we're talking about why people need to do detoxification or depuration, if you want to use the real scientific term amongst us doctors. And it's not having to do with, opioid management or alcohol, management and those types of detox centers, but this is kind of looking at this plague of this century, toxicity in the body. So welcome back, Doc.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
Yeah. Now, we were talking about emotions and you social worker and toxins. I go back to ancient Chinese medicine and Ayurveda. They believed that emotions were just as bad as toxins, like anger or some of these things. And I'm sure it's normal to have some of these emotions. They're just part of being human. But when do these things become toxic to people? Like, when does anger really become as toxic as bisphenol A on the liver? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think any time that you store an emotion, and by the way, that doesn't just mean the ones that everybody would be considered negative. I put that in quotes because no emotions are negative. They just are what they are. Mm-hmm. But if we store it and feel like it's being swallowed, and I use that word very much because what happens to a lot of us in our society today is that we swallow, we internalize our emotions, and we suppress them or pull them into our bodies. So I'm in a unique place of looking at people from a chiropractic standpoint, looking at them from in their spine and their structure, and then the work that I've done, I do a lot of organ massage, and then the emotional work. So I'm watching when I'm working on people all the time what emotions are showing up in their body, whether it's tension release, whether it's anger, whether it's grief. People will often start to release those things spontaneously if they feel safe enough to let them out, but let those emotions out, but they often aren't feeling safe enough in our world because we have a lot of things that are going on and a lot of pressures and stressors. So we tend to hold it in rather than let them out. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to run around and scream, as they're walking down the street because they're angry. But there are therapeutic ways to release anger in a safe and an appropriate way and to realize that it's just another emotion. It isn't good or bad. It's what happens with it and how we deal with it. And frankly, most of the people that I see in my practice as a therapist as well have had anger directed at them. And when somebody in their family has been angry, it's meant that there's been pain. And usually it's the patient that I'm seeing, the client, that's suffered the pain. So we want to recognize that those things get stored in our body. They go into places, and we know from Chinese medicine that meridians have relationships to emotions when they're stored and housed. So those things play a big role in helping people to detox as well. It's not just a simple act of giving them something. It's also helping people become aware of their emotional bodies, too.
Great. That's interesting. Yeah. So when people start their program, what methodologies are used to detoxify the body?
Well, there are tons, as you point out, detoxification has been around as long as we've been around in one form or another. But and you asked before about testing, I do a lot of work with Zyto, which is a non-invasive testing device that basically uses the resonance inside a person's body to give us information. So what I pick up in those tests, and I've designed my own since I'm a senior trainer in those, is to look at the organs and the particular glands that are struggling the most and what they're struggling with. So depending on what information I get out of the scan that I'm doing, I will design a custom detoxification program based on what I see in those findings. That often includes everything from homeopathic remedies, herbal remedies, functional foods, and what I mean by functional foods are foods that actually work specifically and designed to increase the organs and body's functions. And then I'll use water and hydration, and I'm a huge fan of infrared saunas. Full-spectrum infrared saunas are one of the true gems that don't get as much airtime as they should, but it follows along with the idea of ancient therapies, because heat and sweating have been around for as long as we've been around as a therapeutic detox tool.
Yeah, they back when 9/11 happened at the College of Naturopathic Medicine in Bridgeport, which is real close to the chiropractic college too. We had a clinic based on people that, first responders and other people that were exposed, I guess, to the plume. And we actually ran some interesting objective testing where we actually sent their sweat samples into the laboratory. Well, first what we did is we did some urine testing, and we had people fast on water for 3 days. Now, something magical happens after the third day when your body gets rid of all the glycogen and all the stored starch, and now you're tapping into your fat tissue. And remember, I talked about that was the sequestered toxins. The body doesn't want to release that, but when you fast, you tend to tap into that. And so then we would then take those urine samples, and then we would try to figure out, what toxin the patient had in them. Do you know that when we sent the sweat samples into the lab, and we used the lab that was called AccuChem back in the day in Texas, I think they merged with Metametrix lab now, that the same toxins were coming out their pores from the IR sauna as we determined were in their urine after the fast. Fascinating. And that kind of validated a lot of that literature that has been written about, that the IR sauna really does depurate or clean or mobilize those poisons out through the skin. And I guess the old-time naturopaths, chiropractors called the skin the third kidney. Have you ever heard of that term?
Yeah, actually, I've heard it as the third kidney. Sometimes it's the second liver.
That's a good one. I never heard that one, yeah.
Yeah, and who you're talking to and what reference point. But absolutely, I always think of the skin as a sort of the relief valve. When things are just overwhelmed in the other principal detox organs, the skin is going to bail you out in whatever way that it can, and help by getting rid of some of those toxins or expressing them on the outside of the skin. So I look at a lot of people with psoriasis or eczema or psoriatic arthritis, and my little mind, my little nerdy scientist mind is looking at them and saying, where's the toxic load in this person? Because we want to help their skin, be able to function better, but it's letting us know that there's some real internal stressors going on inside.
So what symptoms are people going to have? I guess depends on how fast you're detoxing them. I guess you can adjust the rate for people if they're having a tough time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, symptoms during this, again, depending on the style or the method that you're doing, I find using functional foods, a la Dr. Bland, as we were mentioning before, he's sort of the father of that, really help people not have as many untoward symptoms. There's likely going to be a headache somewhere or some head pressure. There might be some change in your bowel habits. You might be a little bit constipated. You might be a little bit looser. Rarely does anybody really get diarrhea from doing a detox, but they might find that their bowels are fuller. They look more like the inside of a sausage casing, and they might have never had that before, haven't had that in years if they're constipated. Their sweat may smell differently. They may notice that they actually smell different. Their tolerance to things like heat or light or things that are stimulatory may change. They may need certain temperature to be different in and around their body. I've had people tell me that things change like their eyesight. They see better, or they hear better, or their skin, which was flaky or crusty, begins to smooth out, and they notice that it's not feeling irritated or going to erupt. Their sleep gets different, often gets much better, and they find that they're sleeping and they're actually resting when they're sleeping. And by that I mean there's so many people who go to sleep and maybe get 6, 7, or 8 hours, but feel like they wake up and are not feeling rested. They could just continue to sleep. And that's an important part of detoxification, which is getting a good and adequate amount of restful sleep. So there's a whole host of symptoms or situations that will be different based on the style and method and the age and health of the person you're working with.
That's true. I was thinking comorbidities, someone is diabetic, or somebody like yourself said you were kind of pretty close, and by the way, sugar's a toxin too. When you were talking about the Coca-Cola thing, I was going to say, I need to mention that sugar is an amazing toxin that people don't even think is a toxin.
Yeah, it's so. It's my personal feeling. You probably would agree. If we took out sugar out of, forget the reaction we'd have, but if we could get rid of sugar, there would go 80% of everything that's wrong with us is the fact that we're sugar addicts, and the average American is eating, I think, somewhere around 150 to 170 pounds of refined sugar every year. The average adolescent is eating somewhere over 200. If we eliminated sugar, we'd be so far on our way to being a healthier people. So, and it comes in so many sources, as we know. It isn't just sugar; it's high fructose corn syrup, and the industry has gotten sophisticated about renaming high fructose corn syrup, but it's still there in all of its forms. And then even things that we consider natural, and this is where we really have to get sophisticated, like something like agave, which is quote-unquote natural, is one of the, I think, more devastating sugars that we've come across, because it doesn't get absorbed by every cell in the body as does table sugar or dextrose, but it gets absorbed specifically by the liver, and therefore there's a whole host of things that happen based on eating agave that, again, would be considered a healthy sweetener by a lot of people, that are absolutely toxic for the body.
Yeah, it kind of causes fatty. I've seen people with fatty liver coming in with and using that as a substitute. So and they're like, I don't drink, and I'm like, yeah, well, your liver thinks you do,
That's right.
So it's
doesn't
terrible.
really recognize the difference, does it?
Yeah. So basically, how long? I guess you kind of tailor it depending upon these factors that we talked about, of how long people should detox, and then what do you do when you're done? Because you can't go back to your toxic lifestyle. You try to cut down on the cosmetics and try to heat things up on the stove instead of the microwave, and don't use plastic, and you just try to educate your patients and trying to lead a more natural lifestyle?
Yeah, it's a challenge in our world, but I think it starts back when we were talking about the introduction. How you set this up is also how you end it. If this is about self-love and self-nurturance and really being kind and gentle and respectful to our bodies in ways that we typically don't, whether it's from the sense of storing emotions or storing toxins in our bodies, then we want also to prepare people for the fact that this isn't a one and done. You're not going to detoxify once and say, well, I detoxified, now I can go back and, drink my margarita and smoke my cigarette and, drink my, put my food in microwaves. We have to really help people to understand that it's a lifestyle detoxification as much as a body detoxification. So that means that we need to look. And one of the services that I actually provide is I'll come to people's homes, and I will work with them to detoxify their home, because that's as much of a problem as toxins in our bodies from what we're eating. So although we may focus on this from a functional food standpoint or from a homeopathic or herbal standpoint, your home is where you spend a lot of time, and that may be true in terms of your car and your office as well. I'll go through cleaning products with them and make a list of the things they need to get rid of. We'll open up every cabinet and take out the foods that they shouldn't have when they're done with the detox, and then give them lists of things that they ought to work with more of. We'll look at their sleep center, their beds, and we'll look at what they're made out of. We'll look at their furniture and make suggestions. Now, everybody, of course, can't afford to change everything and do everything all at one time. But if people feel like you have them by the hand and you're teaching them, I find most people are eager to learn, and they want information. They just are overwhelmed with a lot of misinformation, and the Internet, as good as it is, and the world that we live in today, has so much stuff out there that people become overwhelmed really quickly, and when people become overwhelmed, they shut down instead of opening up. So I really try to provide a support system for the detoxification process all the way from beginning to end, and help people see that it's a continuing thing. One of my things that I say to people is that I try to detoxify in some way every day, that it isn't just getting done with one 3-week or a month-long detox. I try to do something every day. For me, I'm in a sauna virtually every day, an infrared sauna. I'm sitting in my office, and there's one right across from where I am right now that I have patients sit in because I want to introduce them to something that they can do that feels wonderful, makes them sweat, will often help them lose those unwanted pounds, but it'll just make them feel wonderful, and they'll sleep better and just notice that their entire body is operating in a slightly different sort of frequency than it was before.
And they're kind of affordable now. I've actually seen them, these portable saunas. I actually went to an Ayurvedic thing, and we just sat on a chair with a crock pot under us and covered ourselves with layers and layers of wool blankets, and I forget what else. But I mean, you can go low tech or as high tech as you want with the saunas. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, they've come onto the market in a big way. The only thing I would caution again here is really be careful about the materials that they use to make them, and the electromagnetic fields that are produced around them, because it's not something we've talked about yet, but electromagnetic pollution is another real source of pollution. And if you're putting a field together with electrodes or and motor or engine there, you want to make sure that it's a low EMF field and that the material isn't toxic. Unfortunately, a lot of the ones that come out of China are pretty awful. And the ones that are made of wood, you have to be really careful that the wood is not from trees that are grown at low altitudes, because the wood gets infested with insects and parasites, and then they use sprays on them, and so you're getting wood that you're basically heating up and releasing all of those toxins into the sauna with you, which seems so utterly absurd when you think about what you're doing in a sauna in the first place.
Huh. So you even have to look at that, and I like your idea of less toxic home. I'm sure you recommend different water filters to people, and how they can take, at the source of their drinking water, recommend that, and whole program. That's wonderful. Well, tell us, we're running out of time, so tell us a little bit about how folks can get in contact with you.
Well, they can visit my website, which is drdbrant.com. It's DRDBRANT.com. And they can also call either my New York office or my Glen Cove office. So I have one in Manhattan and one in Long Island. And the phone number to reach me there is 516-609-0890.
Boy, it's been a great journey talking about detoxification. We covered a lot of ground here and really have a deep, in an hour, a pretty deep understanding of what folks have to do on a regular basis. Any last words before we sign off?
Yeah, other than this, detoxification isn't about a specific thing. It's about recognizing that we're not doing in our current society. And the act of really detoxifying is an act of self-love and self-nurturance. And for me, that's a big part of what I get to teach people and help people with in their lives, which is finding better ways to love and take care of ourselves. That's the whole name of the game as far as I'm concerned.
Well, thanks, Dr. DeBrand. I appreciate your time and expertise and giving our listeners some really great information.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Okay, have a great day. And that does it for another edition of The Natural Nurse and Dr. Z. We want you to stay healthy, folks. Bye-bye.